Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and I'd like to welcome you to the Practical Stoic Podcast, where I give you practical Stoic advice for modern times. If you'd like to learn more about Stoicism, or if you want some added inspiration in your day, just go to my website. It's risetothegoodlife.com. If you're interested in transforming your life with Stoic principles, then I also offer one-on-one coaching. To book your first free session, just head to risetothegoodlife.com/coaching and follow the links. But for now, enjoy this episode. Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and welcome to the Practical Stoic Podcast. Now, in today's episode, we've got a pretty special interview for you, and I'm speaking with Roderic Yapp. Now, I'll give you a little bit of a backstory about Rod. So he actually emailed me a few weeks back and said that he was a fan of the podcast and loved what I was doing. And, you know, when I started talking to him and I started learning about what he's doing with his life and what he's already done with his life, you know, I got really interested in finding out more. And so that's what led to this interview, because Rod is such an incredible person, and you'll know that as soon as I read you his biography here. So I'll read you some notes about him. All right, so Roderic Yapp is a specialist leadership consultant and accredited coach. He supports major business transformations by improving the capability of leaders so that they can execute the transformation strategy. He is a former Royal Marines officer, and he was fortunate enough to lead Marines on operations around the world. And some of his highlights while serving in the military include serving in Afghanistan in 2007, evacuating civilians from Libya during the Arab Spring, and leading the recapture of the 55,000-ton MV Monte Cristo from pirate control in 2011. Rod is an International Coaching Federation professionally accredited coach who has specialist experience in developing people in sectors where leadership failure usually results in death or critical injury. He has significant experience in leadership development, major business transformations, and operational excellence with companies such as Fidelity, HSBC, John Lewis Group, Jaguar Land Rover, and many more. And on top of all of this, Rod is also a Stoic. And so I know that you guys will understand why I wanted to have Rod on the podcast. You know, he's just got such great experience in so many areas of life. And I was especially interested in knowing, you know, what is this link between Stoicism and the military? And so we talk a little bit about that as well, and many other topics. So I'm so excited for you guys to hear this interview. I had such a great time. And without further ado, I present to you Roderic Yapp. All right, so Rod, I've been really excited to have you in this interview because, you know, I really think that your military background mixed with your study and practice of Stoicism can offer some really helpful insights. And, you know, I've read a bit of an intro about you already, but I'm sure the listeners would love to hear it from you. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I guess the best place to start is kind of my first career. So straight after university, I was commissioned as an officer into the Royal Marines. I joined in 2005. And I guess just to sort of cover off the reasons I joined, I really wanted to do something that was challenging and difficult. You know, from a fairly early age, I kind of learned that the harder road was generally the one that was going to be more satisfying in the long term. And there was a sense of joining the Royal Marines where I was just sort of wondering whether I could or not, whether I was good enough to get in, and then whether I was good enough to sort of survive training. Unfortunately, I did. I got through it all, 15 months of officer training down at Lympstone in the southwest of the UK. And then I spent 7 years serving and leading men all over the world. In 2007, I served in Afghanistan with 40 Commando. In a place called Sangin in the Helmand Valley. So every day leading, you know, patrols against the Taliban, you know, fighting day in and day out, dealing with IEDs and all those sort of kind of things that I guess a lot of my peers did as well. In 2011, I was sent to Libya at very short notice to go and evacuate civilians, EU personnel from Benghazi. As the Gaddafi regime collapsed. And then towards the end of my career, the sort of last couple of years, I specialized in counter-piracy. So I did 2 tours off the coast of Somalia and was fortunate enough to be in command and the right place at the right time when we were sent to rescue some mariners on a ship called the Monte Cristo, which had pirates on board. We were sent to basically go and rescue them. We arrested the pirates, handed them over to the Italian authorities, and then I found myself in Rome and in Seychelles acting as a witness for the prosecution, which is kind of one of those moments where you just wonder how did I end up here? And I left the Corps for kind of three quite distinct reasons. One, when I joined, I was 23. I really didn't have any responsibilities other than to myself, so I was sort of focused on kind of doing what I wanted to do. I got married in my final year, and I knew I wanted to have a family, and I didn't really want to be away from them. Added to that was that the jobs behind me sort of looked better than the jobs ahead of me, and I sort of felt that, once you've led 30, 40 men on operations, I didn't really see the value of leading 120 potentially on exercise. And after the the time that I had there, I think we pulled out of Afghanistan in 2014, and I just got this sense that in the UK, the British military were going to be left fallow for a sort of period of time. I could just see that happening. And that's generally been the case. I think politically, we've sort of not got the will to send men overseas at the moment, and I didn't really want to spend time in the military while that was the case. So I left in 2012. I left having achieved everything I wanted to do and having absolutely loved it. It was a fantastic first career, and I don't regret a single thing I did. But I got some really good advice, which was, if you're gonna leave, go and do something completely different. Go into an environment that is on the other end of any spectrum you can think of to your time in the military. And the reason for that is that I think if you go into a different environment, you're creating an opportunity for yourself to learn, because it's just, everything is a sort of learning experience. So I found myself at a company called Urenco, who enrich uranium for the nuclear fuel cycle. So the military and then into the nuclear industry is about as big a jump as it gets. This was a company based in the northwest of the UK, heavily unionized, a relatively senior workforce who were quite suspicious of change and transformation, and who also, frankly, had not been particularly well led over the course of the last sort of 30 years or whatever it is. The organization was going through a major transformation, and I was invited to be a part of that, and that's where I started to understand kind of or get involved with operational excellence and sort of some of the techniques that your listeners will be familiar with if they're familiar with lean and those sorts of things. And I guess what my reflections from my 2 years at Urenco were that, performance is all about behavior. How someone behaves in any given situation is what dictates their performance. It sounds pretty simple. And I guess it is, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's terribly easy to do. And I guess this was where my first sort of interest in understanding why people do things, that question started to become interesting to me. And then I worked as a consultant for a bit before sort of setting out to build my own business in 2015, which is what I'm doing now. And what I focus on is kind of developing leaders, and the kind of problem I solve is that, if you read any statistics, there's a huge number of people that really aren't particularly happy in their jobs. That they just don't enjoy what they do day in, day out, and often that comes down to poor management or the relationship with their leadership. And my view is that that's often not the manager's fault. They haven't been particularly well trained. They've often been promoted because they're good at the job and then left to get on with it, and sort of manage a team with all the challenges that comes with that. And that's the sort of problem that I'm keen to solve. And one of the things that I was taught, that I was taught when I was serving in the Marines, is that, you lead by example. It's up to you as to whether it's a good one or not. And you set the tone and the culture for your team or your organization. So if you've got a culture problem, you've got a leadership problem. And I became sort of interested in in that. And, if you take the sort of leadership by example piece a little bit further and go, okay, so what does that mean? I think that good leaders are, to some extent, pretty good coaches, and understanding how people think, helping them think differently about problems and helping shape their perception is kind of a key role of a leader, which is where the kind of interest in Stoicism came from. I'm a massive Tim Ferriss fan. I know you interviewed Ryan Holiday. I've read his book, The Obstacle is the Way. I listened to his podcasts, Tim Ferriss's on Stoicism. And I'm a big fan of Jocko Willink, because I know you are. And I just sort of, put all those things together and was like, right, this is an area that I need to understand in more detail, because this could be hugely helpful. So that's where I've come to Stoicism from, through my background in the military.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all that. I mean, even just listening to your description of your time in the military, I mean, that is the life story of like a superhero. I can't believe that you even have in your resume, your portfolio, I fought pirates off the coast of Somalia. That's one of the craziest things that I've ever heard. If there are any young kids listening, I'm sure they're completely envious. But I really wanted to point out one thing that you said earlier on as well, which I think everybody really needs to grasp here. I love that mindset that you pointed out of the path that is most difficult is going to be the most rewarding. And I mean, I commend you on coming to that decision by yourself and deciding that you want to live your life going on the path that's less traveled. And so I wanted to move on and ask, could you tell us a little bit about how you were first introduced to Stoicism, or what your conversion story was?
Yeah, I think that where it really sort of resonated with me was not a dissimilar reason that sort of, lean and operational excellence really resonated with me when I was at Urenco. It was because I was able, as I started to understand it, I was able to look back at it and go, oh yeah, that's why the military works so well. They don't necessarily call it Stoicism. They certainly wouldn't call it operational excellence. It's just what they do. And I guess that, that was the kind of way that I was sort of kind of introduced to it. And as I started to sort of understand more about it, I sort of started to pick up on the fact that, this was, I guess, a bit of a unspoken philosophy in the military. We didn't really sort of talk about it as Stoicism. It was just how our culture existed. And I have thought about this, and I think that there's kind of three reasons for that. And I guess probably the first one, and the kind of easiest to explain to your listeners, is that when you serve in the military, you're never far from experiencing or practicing poverty. So I know one of the sort of Stoic principles is, practice what your life will look like if you suddenly lose all your possessions, you lose access to, running water, good food, all those kind of things, because it helps you understand that actually you don't need very much to survive. And in the military, when you're on operations in somewhere like Afghanistan, for 3 months, certainly for the first 6 weeks of my time there, we didn't have access to running water. We were drinking bottled water. We were taking water out of a well. We were living in a compound on the edge of the desert, exactly how the locals lived. So, practicing poverty was something that we actually lived and breathed. And it didn't really have a huge sort of impact on me. It certainly didn't make me less happy. And then when you're on, in the UK on exercise, you're never too far from being cold or wet or eating ration packs. So you're permanently kind of reminded that all of this stuff that you can learn to value can be very quickly sort of taken away, and actually you can survive without those things. And I think also that, sort of moving on from that, you quickly learn that there are things that you can control, things you can't, and things you can influence. Things that you can control, I would argue would be around things like, your physical preparedness to go to war. You can control how fit you are, but ultimately you control sort of whether you live or die. If your time is up, if you get really badly hurt, then that's it. Your number's been called. You're coming in. You can't really sort of predict that. And I think that this kind of leads me on to the sort of second point is that, A, you're always sort of practicing poverty, but B, death is always there. It's ever present. You're on operations, me and other people sort of have lost friends, but you're kind of constantly reminded of it because, the organization, defense, the military just in general remembers the sacrifices that people have sort of given. So this kind of idea of memento mori is not particularly far away. I guess the last thing is that when we get things wrong in the military, when leaders fail, when they screw it up, people get hurt really, really quickly. So there's a moral aspect to considering, right, if it can go wrong, it probably is going to go wrong. So let's explore what that looks like, and then let's work out how we mitigate against it. So we do something in the military called wargaming, which is where, a blue team will present the plan of what it is we're going to achieve. And then a group of people will start to tear into it and pull it apart and go, have you thought about these things? What if the enemy do this? What if these helicopters don't turn up? How is your plan going to survive when you've got someone deliberately trying to disrupt and interrupt it? And we practice things like, what's the most likely thing that the enemy is going to do? What's the most dangerous thing that they could do? And I think that, that gives you a pretty good understanding of how to manage and mitigate risk. And I know that, the Stoics will always look to sort of discount the kind of optimism bias that exists and go, look, don't, for example, if you're starting a business, don't expect it to go well. Expect it to fail, understand why that's going to happen, and then work out what you can do to mitigate the risk of that happening. So those are kind of three explanations why I believe it's kind of an unofficial philosophy in the military.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Because I really did want our listeners to understand on a deeper level, why that is the case, why the military is so associated with Stoicism. And I wanted to know from you, because obviously one of the main themes of the military and your training that you did was discipline, really becoming extremely disciplined in everything you do. I'm sure even to the point of the way that you tie your shoes. And I wanted to know, do you think that there are a few ways that you could share with people that Stoicism can help everybody to develop that kind of discipline?
Yeah, I think that the military has a very strong reputation for discipline. Speak to anyone with a military background, and that's one of the first things that kind of people will think about. And I guess my view on this is that my personal view is that I think that generally speaking, people are designed to be goal orientated. We're designed to sort of make things happen. We don't always realize that, though. I think most people sort of have this idea that, paradise looks like sort of winning the lottery and sort of spending the rest of our lives sort of sat on the beach kind of doing nothing. I was one of these people that sort of was lucky enough to kind of take a gap year. And don't get me wrong, I worked and I traveled and I did enjoy it. And it sort of gave me room to think about what I wanted to do in the long term. But I wasn't one of those people that was kind of comfortable sort of spending time forever kind of doing not too much, not being pushed, not being challenged. And I think the key thing about discipline is that if you've got goals, things that you want to achieve, and you're sort of clear on what they are, discipline is what keeps you on track. So if you're not disciplined, it doesn't really matter what your goals are because you're never really going to achieve them. If you want to lose weight, get fit, if you want to eat healthily, whatever it is you want to do in life, if you're missing that ingredient of discipline, then you're going to really, really struggle to achieve that. And I think that, this also comes back to the kind of leadership by example. As you know, I've got 2 young children. I've got a 4-year-old daughter and a son who's coming up to 20 months old. And I think that, if I lead my life in a sort of disciplined way, if this is just the way that I approach things, I eat healthily, I get up in the morning, I work out at the start of the day, I hope that just rubs off on them, because they just see father is doing that. And that's kind of important to me. I think that, you set an example in the workplace, you set one at home as well. We learn a huge amount from our parents, and I want my children to pick up the habit of discipline from me. That's my intent anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think leading by example, that is one of the most important principles that anybody can understand in any area of your life that you're trying to, if you want other people to act in a positive way towards you, then act in that way towards them. It could even go back to my latest episode that I did on Monday, which was all about being the change that you want to see in the world. Act by example. And
I completely agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was really interested in asking this question, because I think it could give us some really awesome insights into your mind while you're going through training. But I was wondering, was there ever a time during your military training when you felt like you were about to give up? And if so, what was it that made you keep on going?
Yeah, so absolutely is the short answer. I don't think it would have been hard enough if you didn't think that from time to time. To be really honest with you, I was not one of the strongest officers in training. I passed out and sort of comfortably at the bottom quarter of my batch, the bottom quarter of the people that survived, I guess. But I guess the way I sort of thought about it, or kind of what got me through it, was that, and this kind of works on a sort of long-term scale. So training is 15 months long, but also there are parts of it that are extremely tough. You're being thrashed physically, or you're marching from A to B, carrying a huge amount of weight. I kind of thought in the back of my mind that, at the start of anything, for the sort of first third, you haven't given this enough to sort of give up yet. You haven't given this everything you got. And that was what I had in my mind at the start of the first 3 months of training, or the first 30 minutes of any kind of physical period of thrashing or anything that was particularly challenging. And then once I passed that point, and I started to think, actually, I don't want to do this anymore. This is horrific. I sort of changed the way that I thought about it, and was like, well, if you give up now, everything you've done up until this point will be for nothing. It will all be a complete waste of time. All the training, everything that you've invested, both physically and mentally in this. And I think that once you play those sort of mental tricks with yourself, and that's kind of what worked for me. Also, I know that, one of the things that I found really worked for me was this sort of element of social pressure. I told people that I was going to go and do this. There was no way that I could turn around and go and have a beer with my friends and say, yeah, it wasn't right for me, because I know, and they would have known as well, that I'd have been lying. And I wasn't willing to lie to myself. I'd much rather have said, I just didn't have it in me. I think the sort of first mental model that I thought about, or that I used, was kind of most effective. You haven't given this everything yet, and then switching it to give up now. Everything is for nothing. Everything is a waste of time. And that just sort of keeps you going, another few minutes. And then you get to the end of it, where it's really, you get to the end of whatever it is you're doing, you get a respite, you get a breather, and then you sort of mentally recover from it. And then you just apply that. And then it's a question of sort of continuing to do that over the course of 15 months. Gradually you get stronger, gradually you get fitter. It doesn't hurt as much as you're sort of, starting to push your boundaries, and you come out the other end, and then, you're a Royal Marines commando officer, and you're heading off to a unit to take command of some men. And that was it, really.
Yeah. And I love that mindset of, if you give up now, it's all for nothing. I think so many people need to hear that just in everyday struggles. I can't even imagine the amount of physical torment that you're under in that kind of training. I know that it's pretty elite. And so, I mean, some people would feel like giving up if they wake up and they've run out of their favorite cereal. You know, it's like that. It really puts into perspective. And I mean, speaking of perspective, I didn't mean to do a cheesy segue here, but speaking of perspective, I wanted to know about your time in the military, because you did mention earlier about this Stoic practice of rehearsing poverty and rehearsing calamity. And I mean, during your time, look, we've heard your little introduction about everything that you did in the military. I mean, you would have seen calamity. You would have seen horrors that most of the world can't even imagine seeing. You would have seen poverty and lived it. So I wanted to know, what did your time in the military change about the way that you see the world and humanity and your own life?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of things that that spring to mind, a couple of stories that that I remember, one from Afghanistan and one from Somalia. So when we served in Afghanistan, as you can imagine, we get into firefights with the Taliban, rounds flying everywhere around these sort of villages. And occasionally, unfortunately, people would get hurt. There would be civilian casualties. And we used to, if a civilian got hurt in sort of crossfire of an incident, we would, in 2007, we'd bring them into our base, we'd sort of fix them up, patch them up, and we'd actually pay, we'd give them some money, some sort of US dollars as a sort of very basic form of compensation. And we had this incident where this one woman was being brought in time and time again, and the sort of, the HQ was saying, well, hang on a sec, these are fresh injuries, and we haven't been in a firefight for the last few days, so where are these come from? And basically what had happened was that it was her family that were sort of shooting her. She was the least attractive daughter, according to their sort of view, and this was what they were doing in order to make money. And I remember thinking sort of at that point, I was like, I just don't understand this country. How do we bring peace and stability to a society where this is kind of acceptable? They view this as okay. And I remember that just completely baffling me. And I think the easiest way to sort of think about large parts of the world is don't think of them in terms of geography. If you think of them in terms of where they are located on a map, it's almost not particularly helpful. But if you think of them in terms of time, and if you think of somewhere like Afghanistan as maybe being a bit like the UK was in the Middle Ages, I don't mean that to be offensive in any way, but some of the customs, some of the ways in which they treat their people, their attitude towards violence, I would argue is probably not too different from the UK in the sort of 12th, 13th century or whatever. And that almost finds that is almost helpful, or it certainly was to me in sort of understanding it. The second one was that we arrested a pirate in, I think it must have been 2011. This was different to the Monte Cristo incident. This was just another one, sort of trying to get on board sort of ships in the area. And one of my guys called me over and said, this guy's got a broken arm. I was like, is this a recent thing? And they're like, no, this is clearly an old injury. And I sort of had a look at it. And this young guy, this young Somali, he can't have been older than 19. He had a one arm that was I would say about an inch longer than the other, and he had about a sort of 10-degree angle where his wrist was. And as I sort of looked at it, it became quite clear, with the scar tissue and everything that was wrong. Basically, he'd suffered some form of arm break at the wrist. And I'm not a doctor, but I know that quite a lot of important stuff goes through the wrist. And I imagine this was probably damn painful. And basically, he clearly been sort of dosed up with antibiotics, had it, wrapped up and survived somehow. And I just remember thinking, like, wow, as Marines, we think we're pretty tough. And as I said to my guys, from time to time, you lot complain when you can't get second dessert on a ship. These people are really, really tough. And that sort of changes your context. You realize that sort of large parts of the world are completely ungoverned. Whoever's got the biggest stick rules the roost. And I think what that gives a sort of permanent sense of gratitude. People complain. I live in London, and people complain when the tube and the train gets messed up. When snow interrupts our daily lifestyles. And I think if you understand, or if you've served in places like, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, or anywhere, to be honest, in the sort of developed world, you just have to think about that for a second and remember that you won. Just being raised in the West, just living in the West, you absolutely won, because there are people that are under the rule of absolute tyrants. They go through things like, their family members dying every single day. And I think it's hard not to experience those kind of places and not come out with a complete sense of gratitude for what it is you've got. And I found that, and I know this is a sort of question that you'll be curious to ask, but, one of the Stoic practices that I find most useful is journaling. When I've got a problem and something going around in my head, sitting down, writing out what the problem is, and then just going through the sort of questions of, is my wife healthy? Yes. Are my children healthy? Yes. Have I got a roof over my head? Yes. But I don't really have problems. I have my issues that I need to deal with. And it just gives you a sense of perspective. I remind myself of what it was like to live in somewhere like Afghanistan. And it just gives me that sort of sense of perspective and gratitude that I think is really valuable. You can't change the problems. You can only change the way that you think about them. And that's really what I try to do wherever I can.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And, I'd really love to know, do you think that there is any way that a person who is a regular civilian in a regular job living an ordinary life can get this kind of perspective and gratitude that you have as a result of you seeing these things? Is there any way that they can get that without seeing what you've seen in the military or going where you've gone?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're reminded of it every single day. You only have to watch the news. If you really, really want to understand, what the world looks like for many people, just flick on YouTube and start looking at, what conditions are like in Somalia. We've got access to so much information now. That's one of the beauties of the internet. These places aren't sort of dark and unknown. We can literally find out what it is like to live there now. And I think, this is something that I was sort of taught well before I kind of came across Stoicism. But, if you want to be happy, compare yourself to someone that has far less than you. Remind yourself that in the grand scheme of things, in that pecking order, you're doing pretty well. If you want to make yourself really unhappy, compare yourself to someone that you perceive has more than you. Compare yourself to the millionaires or the billionaires of this world. And you'll permanently be miserable. And I think that, to be honest, is kind of the way in which I think most people can apply that practice without having to go to those places.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to move now from your military background up until right now what you're doing with your leadership firm. And I wanted to know, do you think that practicing Stoicism can create better leaders? And if so, how do you think it can?
Yes, in short, absolutely. Because I think, I truly, as I've said before, and you probably sort of pick it up on this, I truly believe in this sort of concept of leadership by example. So, if you take that seriously, then pretty quickly you realize that living a virtuous life is important. And I think that this is one of the things about leadership that kind of makes it so tricky. Is there's a sense of an ethical and a moral element to it as well. It's not good enough just to lead people in a direction if you're not sort of thinking about, what are the moral implications of what I'm doing. And if you look at kind of any scandal that has rocked any industry, in the UK, we've had, I've had the expenses scandal, banking has suffered with sort of libel scandals, so on and so forth. All of those are incidences where people knew what they were doing was wrong and they did it anyway. So I think that an understanding of Stoicism, an understanding of sort of virtue as the ultimate goal, helps you be a better example. I also think that this sort of habit of learning, Stoicism encourages people to sort of continuously look to improve their knowledge and their understanding of the world. I think that there's a common misconception that learning is something that we do at school and university, and that if you want to learn something, you've got to go and do a course and get a certification. And I just think that's absolute nonsense. There are many, many places, there are many ways that you can learn. Most of your listeners are listening to podcasts right now. I think these are an unbelievable asset in terms of helping you learn about the world. And I think listening broadly, listening to opinions that maybe you don't agree with or things that are different. So sort of covering things like, Stoicism, philosophy, psychology, Tim Ferriss, I think, is brilliant. Jocko Willink, Joe Rogan. These people are giving gifts away for free. And I do think that time is never wasted if it's spent in the pursuit of knowledge. Ultimately, I think the kind of whole sort of leadership by example piece comes down to your behavior. What is it that you actually do? And I think that one of the reasons I found Stoicism so helpful is that it gives you an insight or a way to kind of discipline yourself, to remind you of what truly is important. And if you think about back to the sort of problem I spoke about before, one of the reasons people I think are so unhappy in their jobs is because, certainly in some areas, it's completely acceptable for their boss to lose their temper, to get really irate, to get really angry with them when they want something done. And that's not leadership. That is driving people through a climate of fear. And that really isn't going to that isn't going to release their potential. It's not going to make them want to work for an individual like that. So I think this sort of element of kind of self-control, controlling your reaction when things go wrong, is a hugely important element of it. And you see it, I see it, it's one of the areas that sort of I have learned and I've developed from. Often when you're in conflict with other people or when things are going wrong, you will fall back on the examples that have been set for you. So if you think about how you react to challenge or conflict, you've probably taken huge amounts of that from your parents. So I think, it's kind of incumbent on a parent to sort of think about the example that they set and think about, right, well, how can I improve that? Because ultimately, if you can improve that, you can have a sort of more positive impact on your children. And certainly that's kind of what I want to do.
And, I'd really love to add something to that because, as much as I think it's important for parents to recognize the influence that they have over their children, I also think that it's really important for us, every single individual, to recognize that so much of who you are and what you do and how you do it comes from your upbringing and comes from the influence of your parents. And so these aren't necessarily fixed. We don't have to keep these potentially negative habits or these negative mindsets. We can change them. They're not fixed. And, I wanted to move on and maybe ask, could you maybe tell us about a couple more Stoic practices that you find to be most helpful in your life?
Yeah, sure. So the learning thing is kind of key. It might be helpful if I sort of explain kind of how it is I do that. So I think of ways in which I can turn. So I'll go back a step. So there's a concept in sort of lean and operational excellence of value add and non-value add time. Okay. And value add time is basically time spent improving the performance of your people. So, coaching, planning, helping them to develop, helping them to be better at their jobs. Okay. If you're a leader, you should be looking to spend half of your time adding value to your team and improving their performance at least. And I think about this and I sort of thought about that. Okay, well, that's an interesting concept. So where are the kind of gaps where I've got non-value add time and how can I turn them into value add time? So what I've started to do, or what I've been doing for the last few years, is every time I'm on public transport, I'm not working, I'm not checking my emails, I'm not, reading and writing those things that, those will have their own rhythm that will happen. I'm sat there listening to podcasts, or I'm reading a book. So, turning this kind of dead time into value add time, and creating the sort of space to learn, at least an hour a day, I find really helpful. On days where I'm working from home, if I've been to the gym in the morning, what I'll do in the afternoon is because I'm basically sat down for large parts of the day, I'll throw in what I call a sort of false commute, and I'll go for a walk for an hour and just listen to a podcast. And then once a week, or once every couple of weeks, I'll think about what it is I've learned or what I've picked up on, and I'll write about it. And if you think what it is you do at university, you take on information, hopefully new stuff, you think about it, and then you write about it. And that forces you to think and crystallize your argument or your view and kind of share it with your experience. And that's why I blog, not only because, people find it valuable, but because it forces me to learn. It kind of drives the behavior before that. As I sort of briefly alluded to, I'm a big fan of exercise. I was fit in the Marines. I still would consider myself reasonably fit now. And I think that a little bit of suffering every day is kind of helpful to remind you that you can deal with it. So it doesn't really matter what you do, whether you're a runner, whether you're a swimmer, or whether you like lifting weights. I think that, if you're training the body, you're also training the mind. You're reminding yourself that you can push yourself, and that you can sort of suffer a little bit every day. And lastly, I've talked about the journaling, but, the Stoics have this concept of the sage, the sort of perfect being, who I almost think about as the sort of ultimate leader by example. And this concept of, before you make a decision, have a brief moment to consider what would the sage do. So I'll give you one that's very specific. So since I left the military, I've sort of, I have struggled with my weight kind of going up and down because, for all kinds of reasons. I'm growing a business, I've got a young family, I can chuck in all those excuses. But ultimately, if you want to lose weight, it comes down to what you eat. So every time you kind of approach, you're about to go and order something in a restaurant, you're about to go down to the kitchen and make yourself something to eat, think about, what would the sage do? What would the sort of perfect person eat at this point? And then create the sort of space for you to take yourself off autopilot and sort of change your habits and start to sort of kind of replicate that. And then the journaling, what I do is, I'll sit down and I'll review the last 24 hours. How did I do? I won't beat myself up if I had a little bit of an extra chocolate or a glass of wine in the evening, but I will say, okay, so you did that yesterday, get back on track, remind yourself what it is you're trying to achieve. And then going forward, I'll think about, right, what do the next 24 hours look like? And I'll identify what I sort of define as slippery places. So I think I must have got this from Tim Ferriss, because he talked about Alcoholics Anonymous having this idea of, look, if you don't want to slip up, don't go where it's slippery. And take alcohol out of the equation and think of Alcoholics Anonymous as just a really successful behavior change organization. I think you can kind of learn from what it is they do. So when I'm journaling, I'll think about, right, where have I got potential for sort of slippery places? Am I going out in an evening? If I'm going to go out on an evening on a Friday night and I'm going to have a few pints with some of my friends, fine. But, have I got opportunities to kind of eat very healthily throughout the rest of the weekend? And I think that this just makes you really present and draws you into what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, and reflect on how you can improve. To some people, that might sound sort of pretty OCD or pretty addictive, but I do think that's what works for me ultimately, and I think that's what we all have to work out, right? We have to work out what works for us as individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that makes perfect sense. And I even talked about this in one of my earlier episodes, this idea of, if you know that you're about to make a decision that is probably not the right decision, then just pause for a moment, take a step back, maybe even picture yourself above the situation and think, what is the consequence of what I'm about to do right now? And I mean, even Seneca talked about this idea that we should constantly have somebody in our view that we want to emulate, somebody who is far better than us, who is an example of who we want to be. And I know you were talking a little bit about that as well, and following positive examples. And yes, that you just dropped so much value there. I know that people are going to take a lot of what you're doing there and actually use it in their life. And I wanted to know from you, was there ever a time where Stoicism or Stoic principles have helped you to get out of a bad situation or to come back from a failure?
Yeah. Of course. I mean, my view is that, if you're not failing from time to time, you're not pushing yourself hard enough, you're playing it too safe. I don't ski very often these days, but certainly when I used to, I sort of had in the back of my mind that, if I wasn't falling occasionally, I was probably not taking enough risks, and I probably wasn't sort of improving myself. I guess this sort of idea of, the Stoics have the sort of concept of amor fati, love your fate, learn to love your fate, and you'll be a happy person. I kind of remind myself on that, if I miss an opportunity or something doesn't work out the way I think it's supposed to, I remind myself that, I'm unhappy because I thought I could control the outcome, and that's not the case. I can only control the process. I can only do my best at everything that I do, and apply myself in every way. But that doesn't give me control over the outcome. So this sort of idea of kind of loving your fate and accepting that this wasn't the path for me for whatever reason, is kind of how I do it. And also it comes back to this sort of gratitude thing. If you've had a failure of some sort, sit down and think about, right, how could this position be much, much worse? How would I feel if, one of my children was taken to hospital today, with something, something like meningitis or something really, really serious? How would I feel if one of them got, hit by a bus or was, really seriously injured in some sort of incident? How would that put me in perspective? How would that shape how I think about this current problem or this issue? And the answer always is that I wouldn't even be thinking about it if I'd had that as an issue, if that was sort of on my plate. So just a sort of reminder that, things can always be worse. I'm not a Syrian refugee, fleeing from my home, trying to cross into Turkey and then into Greece to get to Europe, seeing my children at significant risk. And I think that's just really, really helpful. If you can just keep coming back to that, then that's useful.
Yeah, Rod, I absolutely agree with you there. I think that gratitude is just one of the most important emotions that we can cultivate in our life, the most important virtues. It's just so helpful for every single aspect of your life. And, Rod, I want to be respectful of your time, so I only have a few more questions to go. And, I wanted to know if you could take one Stoic out to coffee and have a conversation, who would it be and why?
So I think this is a really good question, but also one that I find quite hard to answer. Because on the one hand, I'd be sort of curious to have a conversation with Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man at the time, and find out how he used it. But I think if I was to be given the opportunity to sit down with one of them, it would probably be Socrates. And the reason being is that Socrates, Socrates wasn't afraid to sort of say what it was he believed. And when it came to sort of the end of his life, his subsequent trial, I mean, the story is pretty impressive. He was well known for sort of challenging the way that people thought and getting his students to challenge, the widely held beliefs that their sort of forefathers and ancestors had passed to them. He was put on trial, and I think the story goes that he could have escaped, but he chose to stay, and he chose to fight and go go to trial despite knowing the consequences, which would likely be his death. And I think, from my perspective, I really admire that moral courage. The desire to do, or the desire to do exactly what you believe is right, no matter what the consequences. And I think about sort of modern times that we're in now. There are people that are doing that, and they are paying a penalty, nowhere near as sort of severe as death. But I follow people like sort of Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, who I don't agree with everything they say, but I really admire the courage that they have to say it, because they get hammered for that. They get no platformed. They get accused of being offensive, and I don't think they are. I think they're not afraid to say things that other people are perhaps unwilling to say. And I think the sort of price for it is that they get hammered on social media and accused of being bigots and racists and all these kind of things. So I admire this act of sort of speaking truth, no matter what the consequences are. I think that takes real courage, and I think that Socrates perfectly demonstrates that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that would be a super interesting conversation, finding out, how he had that kind of courage. And I wanted to ask, are there any books or resources that you would recommend that people, read or follow in order to learn about Stoicism if they're just starting out?
So I can share the way I got into it. I think that, what's his name? Ryan Holiday. That's the right one, isn't it? Yeah. So I read The Obstacle is the Way. And I think that what Ryan's done really well is make these principles and this philosophy extremely accessible by telling stories. And I really like that. He's also built on that with, I think it's the Daily Stoic, which is, 365 quotes, which are explained as to what it is they mean. And I think those are really helpful because, reading a short passage with an explanation before you go to bed or when you wake up first thing in the morning kind of sort of peppers your thinking and sort of gives you a little bit of a sort of dose of Stoicism every day, which I think is extremely useful. So I think he's a great kind of gateway drug and a great way to kind of get into it. The book that I found is probably the best beginner's resource, or if you're looking to move from Ryan Holiday onto kind of the next level, I think, and I know you've interviewed him, Donald Robertson's Stoicism and the Art of Happiness is absolutely outstanding. I read that in about less than a week, and I'm looking at the sort of copy now, and it's just covered in dog ears. I mean, I might as well have it bookmarked the entire thing. Because he gives a brilliant overview of Stoicism. And I don't think it's the kind of book that, you want to read too quickly. You want to read a bit, think about it, reflect on it. And then once you kind of really learn from it, sort of move on to the next step. But I love people that democratize this stuff, make it really accessible. Some people would say, well, you can get all of that from by reading Marcus Aurelius and Meditations and so on and so forth. And yes, you can, but sometimes it's helpful for someone to outline the broader concepts before you go sort of looking for them for yourself.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rod. I think that's a helpful tip to tell people to, look for something that's going to explain the philosophy to them before they really dig into the heavy stuff. And, my second last question that I wanted to know, it's a bit of a strange one, but I think you'll have a good answer to it. And it's this: if you could send one text message to every person in the world, what would that message say?
So I have thought about this, and I guess, the obvious one would be the sort of amor fati, love your fate. But I almost think that's just sort of too obvious, if that makes sense. So I'm going to steal this from Jocko Willink, who I think is a brilliant example of a Stoic, although he might not necessarily have read all the Stoic material. I don't really care. He often talks about, discipline is freedom. And that would be my text message. And the simple reason is because I would like to think people would go, well, hang on a sec, what's that all about? Maybe dig a little bit deeper into this sort of subject matter. And I think that if they can get to the stage of understanding that if they can control their passions, if they can control their, their appetite, if they can control their, desire for material possessions and sort of defining their life as being successful, the more stuff they have, which I think a lot of people do. I don't think that's necessarily the right way to do it. If they can free themselves from the mercy of these passions, that's going to be the most helpful thing. Because I think a lot of people are, not particularly happy because they're, maybe they've got the sort of golden handcuffs, or they're sort of stuck in their current jobs. And I think getting them to sort of reflect on the fact that, actually, let's sort of think slightly differently about this. Let's think about, if I didn't need to earn as much money as I do, what could I do with my life? I think that would be something that people would find valuable. Disciplining their passions, and realizing the freedom that comes with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a message that the whole world needs to share. Discipline is freedom. I love that. And I love when Jocko talks about that. And speaking of which, as I mentioned, I really wanted to ask this question because I feel like it'd kind of be fun for our listeners to hear this and also to give us a bit of a perspective of what you went through with the military training. If you don't have an answer to this, or if you can't really remember that much about it, you feel free to not answer. But could you tell us from start to finish what the toughest day of your training looked like?
Gosh, that's probably pretty difficult because I probably blanked out most of it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think I can actually. So at about the 8-month point of being, going through training as a sort of commissioned officer in the Royal Marines, there's, I guess, this stage where you go through something called the commando course. And everyone focuses on, when you're a civilian, you focus on these things called the commando tests, of which there are 4 of them. Basically, you have to do, an assault course in a time, 2 different assault courses, one that's very sort of short and sharp and extremely aggressive called the Tarzan assault course. You sort of go around that in a few minutes. It's pretty unpleasant, but at least it's over quickly. The other one you have to do is something called the endurance course, which is I think it's a 7 or 8 miles timed run that starts off with sort of, loads of pools and tunnels. So you run this thing soaking wet. You then have to get to a range at the end of it and fire your rifle. I think it's 10 shots on target, which means that you have to protect your weapon and you have to keep it clean. So it's entirely applicable to the role of a Marine. The third one is a 9-mile speed march. So you're as a squad group, as a group, and you basically run over a sort of series of country roads and trails as a group, finishing and then going into a troop attack at the end of it, so proving that you can fight at the other end. And then the last one is this 30-miler where you're carrying kit and a weapon, and you're covering 30 miles in 8 hours if you're a recruit, 7 if you're an officer. And again, I've talked a lot. I've probably bored your listeners to death with this concept of leadership by example, but that gives you an example of how the Marines do it. We expect our leaders to be able to perform to a higher level. We have higher standards for their behavior and their performance. And, most of the other tests are not too much harder. There's not that much of a difference, but, over 30 miles, taking an hour off the time, that really makes things challenging. And everyone sort of focuses on those 4 tests, which are done inside 1 week. But actually, what's really difficult and where my worst day was in the exercise before that, because what they do is they put you through a really, really tough, physically demanding exercise, the first stage of which you basically do something called yomping across Dartmoor, which is a pretty rugged and unhospitable part of the UK. It's always wet. It's always soft underfoot. It's extremely hard work. The weather closes in quickly. And you basically crisscross the whole of that national park, carrying, I can't remember how much it was, but it was definitely upwards of sort of 60 kilos, which is a hell of a lot of weight. And after you've been doing that for a few days, the straps on your backpack start to sort of cut into your shoulders. Physically and mentally you're exhausted. And I remember we went into sort of harbour position at one night. The weather was horrendous. We were coming towards the end of this phase, so all of us were completely exhausted. And I remember having to deliver a set of orders for, I think it was a recce patrol or an observation, or an OP, an observation post, and completely screwing them up. I could barely think. That they were just a rubbish set of orders. I'd missed loads of things. The detail wasn't good enough. And my troop sergeant, the troop sergeant who was on the training team, sort of pulled me apart for it. Rightly so. I had a standard to achieve and I didn't achieve it. And I remember being, sort of going to bed that evening. I think we were getting up first light to go and do this patrol. And I literally felt like I closed my eyes for what could only have been a minute. And because you're so tired, you're asleep immediately from the second you lie down. And it was my turn to get on the sentry position. And it was absolutely chucking it down. It was just the worst weather you can imagine. And I said to the guy that was relieving me, I said, I'll give you £100 if you do this sentry for me. And he was like, that's just not enough. Get yourself out. I was like thinking, this is ridiculous. To sit and sort of look into the darkness for an hour, most people would take that. But actually, it just wasn't enough. It wasn't worth it. The sleep was more valuable at that point. And I remember sort of, smiling about that and kind of thinking about it, over the sort of, I guess over the last sort of few years. And it just reminds me how ridiculously hard it all was. And if I can get through that, then, provided I've got a warm bed to get home to every night, everything else sort of needs to be put into perspective. So probably the toughest day.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. I know that's going to be, it'll be interesting and fun to listen to for all of our listeners, because it's hard to even get a grasp of what the training is like. And so I was really interested in trying to understand, just how grueling it was. And, on that note, Rod, I just want to thank you so much for coming on this show. I know that our listeners have just gotten so much value out of every single thing that you've been saying. And I want to give you a chance to share with them where they can go to follow you or support your work or find out what you're doing. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of places. So I write on my website, normally once a week, once every couple of weeks. That's leadershipforces.com, all one word. I'm perfectly happy for people to connect with me and reach out to me on LinkedIn. So very comfortable with that. That's probably the platform that I use kind of most often, and where I sort of share my ideas and thoughts about leadership. There's another thing that I do that I think is extremely valuable and relates heavily to Stoicism. So I work with another company on an associate basis. So I sort of get, I work with them on a kind of day rate. And the company is called Quirk Solutions, and they're UK based, but they are experts in this whole wargaming process. And as I sort of briefly alluded to, wargaming is a process where a blue team, share what it is their plan is, and a red team pull it apart. And, that relates very heavily to Stoicism, about kind of preparing for the worst, sort of getting rid of this optimism bias and sort of practicing like, right, okay, so if it can go wrong, where will it go wrong? And what are we going to do about it? And what it does is, as a process, and I facilitate this with a guy called Chris Patton, who's probably the UK expert at this. What it does is it kind of creates actions, exposes risks and opportunities, and ultimately it strengthens the plan. And I think with any organization sort of looking to go through any form of sort of transformation or looking to try and execute something, this is a really, really helpful process to go through. So my website, leadershipforces.com, but also quirksolutions.co.uk. They're the sort of UK's wargaming experts. And if you're interested in that, sort of go and have a look at their website, have a look at the process and sort of see if there's anywhere that you think that this could be useful. So those are the sort of two areas that I think that, I'd like people to sort of follow up on if they're interested.
Yeah, awesome. And look, I really encourage everybody who's listening to this, go and find any way that you can to follow Rod. I know you've got exciting things coming up in the future as well, and I know that people will be interested in that. And I also want to mention before we go that, hopefully everybody who's listening to this, you won't have noticed this, but we've actually been practicing Stoicism pretty heavily throughout this whole interview because it's been extremely windy outside here, which has led to many failures in the connection. So we've stopped and started this interview many, many times. We've been practicing our Stoicism and controlling our reactions to our potentially negative emotions here. But, Rod, I just want to thank you so much for being so amazing throughout this whole process and also just for coming on the show and sharing your story with us. And I know it's going to be extremely useful for so many of our listeners. And look, I'd love to have you back another time.
Simon, no worries. It's been a real pleasure to sort of share my experience with you and sort of how I think about this stuff. I think your podcast is brilliant, mate. I absolutely love it. I think you provide people with, practical value. If these things aren't practical, it's kind of like, well, it's good in theory, but sort of doesn't really help in my day-to-day life. And I think you're making a real difference, mate. So please keep going. It's brilliant stuff.
Well, I appreciate that. And look, all I can hope is that people are getting value out of this. And I know that with this interview, they will. So once again, thank you so much. And I'll talk to you another time.
Thank you.
All right. So there you have it. What an amazing person. I was so grateful that I met Rod and was able to have him on this show because I know that you guys will take so much from his life experience there and use it in your own life. And, this episode is a perfect example of why I'm so grateful for this opportunity to make this podcast for you guys, because I really do get to meet some amazing people doing great things all around the world. And, that includes yourselves, because I've been so impressed with how many incredible people I'm meeting just from within this community of Stoics listening to this podcast. And so I just want to let you guys know that I'm grateful for you, and I'm really grateful for everybody who's joining the Facebook group and getting involved in conversations or reviewing the podcast or sending me messages or emails. I love this community that we're creating here, and I want to keep it up. So thank you guys again, and I'll talk to you next time. But until then, I hope that this episode has helped you on your rise to the good life. Ciao. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. I hope that you've gotten a lot of value out of it, and I hope that it helps you to live a better life. If you have enjoyed the podcast, then don't forget to subscribe so that you'll be the first to know when there are new episodes. If you really love the podcast, then I would appreciate a positive review, whether that's on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever else you listen. Don't forget that if you're interested in one-on-one Stoic coaching, then you can head to risetothegoodlife.com/coaching to book your first free session today.